Hello, everyone. This is the 163rd episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. Unfortunately, Mr. Paul Whittle from the 1888 letter blog could not make it this time. For this episode, I interview Portuguese podcaster Tiago Filipe Silva of Visão Vermelha podcast as we discuss Benfica during the decade of the 1990s. Welcome, Tiago. Can you introduce yourself and your trajectory into football?
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation, for being here. It's a pleasure to be here discussing Benfica, which is one of my favorite things to do, and especially what we're going to talk about the 90s. And it's a very, marking decade for me as a Benfiquista and for a lot of Benfiquistas out there, right? So yeah, I'm Tiago. I'm 47. Even though I'm from Portugal, I'm currently living in Sweden. Yeah, I've been a Benfica fan since I was five. Actually, a funny story. My dad and my grandparents were hardcore sporting fans, and they kind of wanted me to take me into that trajectory. But when I was five, I actually told my dad, "Well, I think I want to be a Benfica fan," which he was like, "Okay." And then at eight, I told my dad, "I think I want to be a Benfica associate, like a Benfica member." Okay, and it's been like that. So there's something special about this club, and we are very emotional fans, and we give a lot to the club, and we expect the club to give us back also a lot, which also, sometimes it doesn't happen. Yeah. But yeah, I've been following Benfica for since I was five, so yeah, more than 40 years, and I'm part of the Visão Vermelha podcast. We cover Benfica on a weekly basis. We have a live show on YouTube every Monday night, and we're quite vocal and active when it comes to whatever's happening in Benfica. So.
As we get to the decade of the 1990s, can you summarize Benfica's evolution from the 1960s glory years of Eusebio to the end of the 1980s?
As you probably know, in the 60s, Benfica was very dominant because of that amazing team we had, with Eusébio, Simões, José Augusto, Torres, Coluna, Cavém, Costa Pereira, all those amazing players that actually in the 60s and the decade of the 60s took us to five Champions League finals, which probably nowadays, if you say, well, here's 11 Portuguese guys for 10 years and they go 5 years to the Champions League's finals. It's almost unthinkable, right? But that's what they did in the 1960s. They won two Champions League. They were very dominant in the Portuguese competition, so they won a lot of titles. Then jumping on to the 70s with a bit of Eusebio, more into the last years of his career. Benfica was quite dominant as well in the 70s, of course, with other players like Tony, Chalana, Bento, all those amazing players from that decade. And then moving on to the 80s, that's when you saw Porto winning more often. That's when the golden years of Porto came in the 80s. And as we're going to discuss moving into the 90s, right? You can discuss why that happened. I think it was a combination of a lot of factors. First one, the fact that Benfica's management as a club was very poor, as we're going to talk about. So that led to very poor performances, very bad presidents, very bad players, and also the rise of Porto with Pinto da Costa as a president of the club. Of course, we need to discuss whatever happened related to the referees and all those lawsuits against Porto because of corruption with referees and buying them out. That also had an impact, but we got to give them credit for what they've done in the late 80s, beginning of the 90s. So if I can summarize it, you can see in the 60s and 70s, Benfica on the top. On the 80s, we start going down, and then into the 90s, it's a downward slope that unfortunately took 11 years to get out from.
Benfica had lost the 1983 UEFA Cup final, as well as the 1988 and the 1990 Champions Cup finals. Was the curse of Bela Gutmann part of the narrative?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because it's quite a famous thing, right? Bela Gutmann in the 60s, he said that when he left Benfica, that Benfica would never win the European Champions League again or any European title for 100 years, which is actually not true. It's some sort of a urban myth that stayed for so long because Benfica was in 10 European finals in its history, and we lost eight. So we lost all eight European finals since Bela Gutmann said that, right? So everyone goes back to that claim. I was actually with António Simões, probably you know, he was a famous Benfica player in the 60s, and I talked to him about this, and he said, no, that's not true. He never said that. He actually, when he said that, a few years later came to Benfica, and he kind of resaid what people thought he had said. So it's not a real claim. It's not something that you can say it's true because it doesn't really match the truth, right? But I think psychologically, even though you try to explain that, yeah, it wasn't really a curse, it kind of stayed in the fans and the team and the president's minds because we actually lost 8 finals since he said that, right? So in the end, not necessarily true that there is a curse, but we lost so many finals that, yeah, I think that next time when Benfica goes to European final, everyone is gonna think about this at least, right? I think it's more a mental state that you need to get out from instead of just a curse, you know?
You already touched upon this. For most of its history, Benfica's main rivals were the neighbors Sporting Clube de Portugal. However, since 1984, Porto were becoming a force at home and abroad. How was this changing rivalry would affect the landscape of Portuguese football?
Yeah, that's a good question. So before the 80s, before 84, when Porto started winning titles, Benfica were and Sporting were the two biggest rivals, right? They were always fighting for the championships. And then when Porto came, Porto is a team from the north. For you guys that don't know, Benfica and Sporting are from the capital, Lisbon. Their stadiums are 4 kilometers apart, or in the US, maybe 2.5 miles. So very, very close. You can actually see each other's stadiums when you're there, right? So when Porto came, it kind of took the football decisions from the capital also to the north, right? So Porto is a very regional club, of course, even though they have fans everywhere. I'm not going to deny that, but it's a very regional club. So they take advantage of, it's us against the capital, it's us against the central government, kind of a little bit like Barcelona and Real Madrid, especially what Barcelona has been doing forever, right? So that Porto coming in the 1980s kind of reshaped how the strengths were positioned in the country. And then we actually saw more clubs in the north winning titles like Boavista. They won a championship title in early 2000s, which was kind of unthinkable at the time. And actually currently, I would say that the more competitive clubs are based in the north of Portugal, and there are more clubs in the north of Portugal. So that kind of, reshaped how football was positioned in Portugal.
To put things in perspective, since Belenenses won the title in 1946, every title except the title in 2001 has been won by Benfica, Porto, and Sporting.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah, it's a bit crazy that only these three clubs centralize everything. I wish there were more clubs that were more competitive, that could fight for titles, but it's very hard because especially now football is very much based around money and how many good players you can sign, right? And it's almost impossible for a small club to hire a player that costs 20 million, and most of all to pay that player what he would get paid in a bigger club. So yeah, it's kind of sad actually.
Let's get to the decade of the 1990s. As this decade kicked off, Benfica were under the management of the late Swedish manager Sven Goran Eriksson in his
Mhm.
second spell, and they had just lost the Champions Cup final to the great AC Milan team of Berlusconi. Were they expected to continue dominating domestically with Porto, or were there genuine ambitions in Europe as well?
There were genuine ambitions. So the president at the time was a gentleman called João Santos, and that was actually one of the flags of his management. He said, I want a European Benfica. And you could see that on the signings, right? We had amazing players like Moser, Aldair, Valdo, Jonas Stern, Rui Águas. So it was a priority of the club to be strong in Europe. Unfortunately, those were the last times I think that that was part of Benfica's foundation to continue to be strong in Europe, which we don't see that anymore, unfortunately.
As we come to late 80s, early 1990, The backbone of the Benfica team, we have Silvinho in goal. We
Hmm.
have veteran defender Antonio Veloso, Brazilian defender Ricardo Gomes. In midfield, we have the likes of Vitor Paneira, the Swedish Jonas Tern that you mentioned, Antonio Pacheco, Brazilian winger Valdo, the veteran Diamantino, Cesar Brito, the Swedish striker Mats Magnusson, and a teenage Paulo Sousa. So a good team as we come to this decade.
Definitely.
Now, can you explain this phenomenon where in the latter half of the 1980s, I seem to remember, there were many Brazilians in Portuguese football. Some were unknown. Can you explain this whole concept of how Brazilian players were considered as Portuguese nationals when it came to football?
Hmm. Sure. That is related to double nationality, right? So still actually exists to this day. As you know, Portugal, well, discovered, we didn't discover anything, they were already there, but Portugal colonized Brazil, 500 years ago, and a lot of Portuguese people from Portugal went to live in Brazil 100 years ago, 150 years ago. So this leads to a lot of Brazilians born in Brazil, like these Brazilian football players. They have Portuguese grandparents, Portuguese parents, Portuguese uncles. So that facilitates them getting Portuguese citizenship. And that, like I said, it still happens to this day. And there's a very strong connection and relationship between Portugal and Brazil. We speak the same language. We both love football. So that actually led to a lot of Brazilian players getting Portuguese nationality. They had double nationality. They were Brazilian and Portuguese, right? So, and as you know, at the time, you could only have three foreign players playing. So that was kind of way that, the clubs, a way that they found to get them to be able to have more Brazilian players in their squads, but not counting as foreigners. They were Portuguese by law, so yeah, they were not considered foreigners.
As this season kicks off the 1990-91 season, where were you in life and as a fan at this point?
So I was born in 77, so I was 13. I started watching Benfica maybe in I think 1988. I remember clearly those two, well, I'm going to call it Champions League finals, even though they were not called Champions League. They were called European
Champions
Cups.
Cup, yeah.
Champions Cup, exactly. So I clearly remember being like 11 and crying in front of the TV when Veloso failed that penalty and against PSV. I clearly remember the final against Milan that the Benfica players were losing their shoes all the time because they were wearing new boots or new socks, whatever that was. So I clearly remember that. But then going into the 90s, I pretty much spent my teenage years and childhood in the old Benfica stadium, right? So it's very marked in my Benfiquista fandom, but also in my growing up, right? So I still remember it very clearly, which is a bit strange because this was what 30 something years ago. So it was a very defining moment in my life and when I actually started enjoying and becoming a fan of football this decade. So I'm glad you wanted to discuss this decade, not necessarily, of course, the 2000s and after were interesting, and we have some good things to point out about Benfica, but this one specifically is very important for me, even though we were not that successful, but it really taught me a lot about what I want for Benfica, but also what I don't want for Benfica.
For this 1990-91 season, and let's remember, Porto has won the 1990 league title. As far as transfers, we have the Brazilian Isaias coming over from Boa Vista. Again, he was one of those unknown Brazilians who made his name in Europe and would be a
Correct.
backbone of Benfica for the next five
Yeah.
years.
And let me just say this. I don't know if you know, Shahan, but Isaías was the first Brazilian player to play in the Premier League,
Oh, yes, Coventry. Yes, yes,
Coventry,
95.
and he
Yeah,
was the
yeah,
first Brazilian player to score in the Premier League, yeah, when he left Benfica to Coventry. So which a lot of people don't know about that.
yeah. And interestingly, never capped for Brazil.
No,
That's,
never.
yeah,
I mean, they had so many good players in
yeah.
there. Yeah.
Yeah. We have the return of Rui Aguas, who
Yeah.
for two seasons had been at the rivals Porto. scoring goals from them. And remember, he's the son of Jose Aguas, captain of Benfica. So that whole transfer must not have looked good, but he came back home during this season.
Yeah,
You have the Swedish midfielder Stefan Schwarz coming from Malmo. You have another goalkeeper, Neno, from Guimarães, and another unknown Brazilian defender, William, coming from Guimarães, as well as the Bolivian midfielder, Erwin Platini Sanchez, who came from Bolivar. And he'd be a mainstay of the Portuguese league for years to come. The players who departed included the veteran Diamantino, who joined Setúbal. The defender Alvaro joined Estrela de Amadora. Fernando Chalana, legend of the club, joined Belenenses.
mhm,
And the Brazilian defender, after just one season, Aldair, he joined AS Roma in Italy.
that's right.
This season, Benfica would regain the league title. In Europe, they were eliminated from the first round to AS Roma, but they would regain the league title. This was the last title under Eriksson.
Yeah, this is a very special season for me because it was the first season that I saw Benfica become Portuguese champions. So I remember clearly being at the last game of the championship at the stadium. So it was a Benfica Beira-Mar. We won 3-0, if I'm not mistaken. And Rui Águas was actually at the time. So this was, I think, on a Sunday afternoon, very, very warm Sunday afternoon, of course. And at the time, the games were played at the same time. So I remember clearly being on the stadium and Rui Águas scored, and then everyone was listening to the radio broadcast of what was happening in Porto, and Porto was winning at home, and then they had Domingos, which was a player they had, and he was scoring, I think, one goal, two goals, and there was like this discussion around the stadium, and the players knew that, yeah, Rui Águas needed to score to become the best goal scorer of the championship. And actually, at the last play of the match, Neno kicks the ball. Magnussen heads the ball back. Tiago is in front of goal by himself, and he scores the third goal. Benfica is champion, and he becomes the best goal scorer in the league. So I have that season, very clear in my mind. And then we invaded the pitch because at the time you could do that. Impossible to do this nowadays. And I remember I had a piece of the grass. I had a piece of the goal. It was very special times if you love football, right? Very, very different from nowadays. And as you mentioned, we got some really good players and a lot of old glories left the club, like Diamantino, Shalana, and Alvaro also. But unfortunately, we lost Aldair. That was a very good center back that left for Roma, right? But luckily, it was a successful season and it was a very beautiful title for the club.
An important event in Portuguese football history was the 1991 Under 20 World Cup in Portugal, which Portugal's golden generation won with a certain Rui Costa, who naturally would return to Benfica from his loan spell at the end of that season. What was his status at this point, and was it self-evident what an exceptional talent he was at this point?
Yeah, I would agree, even though Rui Costa did a, outstanding career in Europe, but most of his golden years were outside Benfica. I was actually at this game in 1991 for the Youth World Cup. They say that it was the biggest attendance ever at Estádio da Luz with 140 people. The old stadium didn't have any chairs. It was just concrete. So, scooch in, move over, and there were people standing everywhere because there were no seats, right? So it was a quite historical match for everyone that loved football at the time. And Rui Costa was part of that team. Then he was loaned out to FAF, a very small club in Portugal. Benfica loaned him out. But then after that World Cup, he was brought back. Definitely, you could see the talent that he had, even though he wasn't a starter at the team. And even in 1993, 1994, we're going to talk about that season as well moving forward. He was not a starter at probably one of the most marking and important games of Benfica history, which is the win at Sporting 6-3 that led us to the 94 title, right? So I think a lot of Benfiquistas still currently have a lot of respect and admiration for him because he is now the president of the club. But if you look at what he did, and I'm talking about facts, I'm not saying that I like or dislike him. He didn't do as much for the club as a lot of glories did. Like you mentioned, Diamantino, Veloso, Álvaro, Bento, even the glories in the 60s, right? So definitely you could see the talent, but unfortunately he left Benfica at a very young age and came back in the final years of his career. So I wish he could stay longer at Benfica. He would not spend his best years in Milan and Fiorentina, but unfortunately, that's what happened.
We come to the 1991-92 season, still with Sven-Goran Eriksson in his last season. There would be a change of president that year. João Santos would stay towards the tail end of the season before leaving. As far as transfer activity, you mentioned Rui Costa came back from his loan from FAF. You also have the Ukrainian striker Sergei Yuran, well, actually Russian. Well,
Russian, yeah.
yeah,
Born in Ukraine,
yeah,
but yeah,
exactly. Yeah. From Dynamo Kiev, Sergei Yuran. You have Russian defender Vasily Kulkov from Spartak Moscow. And incidentally, both would later join Porto. As far as the players leaving, you have the Brazilians Ricardo Gomes and Valdo. They joined Paris Saint-Germain, now under Canal Plus. The man who scored a handball, Vata, joined Estrela de Amadora. I'm referring to the handball against Olympique Marseille in the
yeah, the
1990
famous one.
Champions Cup semifinal. Yeah.
Yeah,
This would be a season where Porto would regain the title. Benfica would be in the new expanded Champions Cup slash Champions League. They'll be in the group phase playing against the likes of Barcelona. In fact, yeah, Barcelona edged them ahead in the group to reach the final. But overall, in that sense, a disappointing season. But at least Benfica got a taste of this new Champions League.
yeah, for
Yeah.
sure, for sure. It was a season that marked the arrival of the Russians, the three Russians, and you mentioned there Yuran Kulkov and also this other guy, Alexander Mostovoy.
Oh,
In
yes,
my,
I forgot.
yeah,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
no, no worries. In
Yeah.
my opinion, he was definitely the most talented one. From what I hear, and I also spoke with Tony, Benfica's coach at the time, and apparently these three guys didn't really like to practice. They partied a lot, so that had an impact on how they perform on the field. But yeah, we lost a lot of important players. Ricardo and Valdo were, quite significant in the team. Erwin Sanchez, that had some talent, the Bolivian midfielder, also left. Yeah, and unfortunately, it was a disappointing season.
How did the change in the presidency towards the end of the season? We have João Santos leaving and replaced by Jorge de Brito. Did that have any impact on the club institutionally at this point?
Yes, unfortunately, Jorge Brito, he was a hardcore Benfiquista. He lost a lot of money that he put in the club because the club was going through a lot of financial hardship at the time. Yeah, that had a significant impact because Jorge Brito comes in 1992, and a year and a half later, we have what we call in Portugal the hot summer
Oh,
or
yes, yes.
the Verão Quente in 93. That led to financial downfall from Benfica. Benfica players were not getting paid. So that led to Sporting getting two of our best players. They almost got Rui Costa and João Pinto as well. So that presidency, the change in management from João Santos to Jorge Brito had a definitely financial impact. Jorge Brito, the first year and a half, he did a lot of really good things, apparently, because he brought Paul Futre. We had a magnificent team in the 92-93 season, but it was just a way to trick us because we didn't see the financial problems that Benfica was having. And in the summer of 93, we saw that, unfortunately. And also, I can tell you some funny episode in the beginning of the 1992 season. So let me think. Yeah, 92, 93. Tomislav was the coach. He was presented as the main coach at the beginning of the season. As I said, I spent my childhood at the Stadio da Luz, and I would always go to the team presentation, right? So they would have a day, they would present the players, present the team. I remember I was maybe what 15, 14 at the time, and I was standing at the entrance of the Benfica Stadium, and I see Jorge Brito with a bunch of friends of mine. We're all kids, and Jorge Brito comes. He's a very short guy, and he said, "How many of you are here?" And we said, "Oh, I don't know, like 12, 13." And then he said, "Okay, come with me." So he just randomly picked 12, 13 kids. We went up to the board room. He presented us Tomislav Ivic. He showed us the stadium. So I guess that kind of proves that he was a really real Benfiquista, that he loved the club, that he really enjoyed being there. But unfortunately, I don't think he was surrounded by the right people because a management is not only a president, there's a lot of people involved. And that led to that, financial downfall that Benfica went through just a year and a half later.
For this 92-93 season, as you mentioned, Tomislav Ivic, the legendary Croatian manager, is in charge of the team. And he also managed Porto, by the way, right after Champions League triumph in
Mhm.
87-88. Unfortunately for him, he would be sacked and replaced by Tony at the end of October. Now, as far as transfers, we have Abel Javier, the defender, who many remember with his blonde hair in the
Mhm.
2000 Euros and his fiery temper as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, he came from Estrela de Amadora. You have Helder Crisavao arrived from Estoril. Brazilian defender Carlos Moser returned to
Yeah.
Benfica from Olympique Marseille. You also have Joao Vieira Pinto arriving
Yeah.
from Boa Vista, who become one of the emblematic Portuguese players of this mid to late 90s. You already mentioned Paulo Futre, that we'll discuss in detail. He came in January
Mhm.
from Atletico Madrid, one of the greatest Portuguese players of that era. As far as the players leaving, Manuel Bento, who was already not really playing, he finally retired. The Swedish Jonas Stern joining Napoli in Italy, and Mats Magnusson also returns home to Sweden to Helsingborg. This is another season that Porto wins again, and Benfica again finishes second. There's a coaching change. However, you have Benfica winning the cup title, defeating Boavista, and they reach the quarterfinals of the UEFA Cup before being eliminated by Juventus. But again, this is the second consecutive season that they didn't win the title. And at this point, it clearly looked like domestically Porto had the edge in
Yeah.
terms of
Yeah.
winning titles.
This season was very, very frustrating because this squad, quality wise, was probably one of the best squads in the club's history. I mean, we had Moser, Schwartz, Paneira, Isaías, Rui Águas, João Pinto, Rui Costa, Paulo Sousa, Pacheco, Futre. I mean, the list goes on and on. It still strikes me how we lost this championship, ending up only 2 points behind Porto. It was very frustrating. We did win the Portuguese Cup final. I was actually at that game. 5-2, Benfica beat Boavista at the National Stadium. This was in June, I think June 10th, because
Right.
usually they have the final on Portugal Day, which is June 10th. And it was just an amazing performance by Benfica. And we were all excited for the next season, but yeah, unfortunately, we didn't know what was
Mhm.
gonna, all the bad things that were gonna happen after this game. I just want to say one more thing. It's Ivic was a very different coach, I would say. One of the things that he did, which a lot of Benfiquistas still remember, he actually had the pitch at Estádio da Luz shortened, which everyone was puzzled by that. What do you mean? Why are you making the pitch shorter? Because we need space to play. Because he actually said that most of the pitches that Benfica played away, they were smaller. And I remember he did that for 3 weeks, and the pitch looked so weird. Like it was so shortened, and then he changed his mind, and 3 or 4 games later, they resized the pitch, but he was a very curious coach, right? He was not successful at Benfica at all. As he said, he was fired and replaced by Tony. Once again, he comes to the rescue. Benfica wanted him to have the same success as he did for Porto a few years before, but it was, yeah, not a good bet by Jorge Brito, unfortunately.
Getting back to Alexander Mostovoy, can you describe his marriage controversy?
It was a known thing that clubs did at the time. So they would provide for fake marriages. Because if you were actually married with a Portuguese woman, you could apply to become a Portuguese citizen. And that's what happened. Someone paid a Portuguese woman a specific amount of money and said, all you have to do is sign a piece of paper. You are legally married to this guy. You'll never have to see him anymore. Or probably she never did, saw him or spoke with him. And he was married to a Portuguese woman. And then he applied, or the club applied for Portuguese citizenship, and that's it. It was a very common procedure at the time for a lot of clubs in Portugal because it was a way to get around the three foreign player limit. Not illegal. Can you say if it's the most good thing to do and not socially condemnable? Maybe not, but not illegal, and that's what happened with him.
Obviously, one of the most important aspects of his season was the Paulo Futre transfer saga and the diplomatic war it set off with Sporting.
Mhm.
Can you describe that?
Yeah, so Benfica got Paulo Futre in 1993, I think beginning of the year, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, January.
January. And Paulo Futre, he played for Sporting. He went through his development years at Sporting. Then Sporting let him go, which was a bit strange. And then Porto got him, and that's when he became a big player, right? So Futre was always connected to Sporting. And at the time, before Benfica signed him, he apparently had an agreement with Sporting. And the president at Sporting at the time was a guy called Sousa Sintra, quite a funny guy, but a very different guy. And all of a sudden, in a change of scenarios, he signed for Benfica. And that I remember Sousa Sintra, the Sporting president, he went to TV and said, this guy's a mercenary. He just wants money. We had an agreement with him. He bailed on us. So, and I think that even that led to Benfica and Sporting. We have something here that it's an expression in Portuguese, or I don't really know how to translate it in English. They cut diplomatic
Right,
relationships with
right.
Benfica, right? So we're not going to let you into our stadium. We don't expect you to be invited to yours. We don't talk at all because of this, right?
In fact,
Hmm.
when Sporting manager Bobby Robson, he wanted
Hmm.
to scout Benfica, he couldn't go to the VIP stand. He had to
No.
buy his own tickets.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, which doesn't happen nowadays, right? But at the time, when the team said we have no diplomatic relationship between the clubs, yeah, if they got in the ring, they would definitely fight, but it it didn't get to that level. So there were just no type of dialogue between both clubs.
It's been said that there was a lot of shenanigans going on behind the scenes
Hmm.
leading to his transfer. In any case, it was a very short stay for him,
Very
for
short. Yeah,
Futre.
yeah.
Let's get to this turmoil in the summer of 1993 that you already mentioned a few times, which led to the departure of two of Benfica's stars, Pacheco and Souza, to their rivals Sporting. In a way, perhaps it was revenge for the whole Futre saga as well. Now, do you think this is the reference point of Benfica's serious problems in this decade?
I mean, I would say this one was the one that hurt the fans the most. Pacheco was a good player. I wouldn't say necessarily was an outstanding player, but he was a very good player. For example, in 1998, when he played the final against PSV, and and the year after with Milan, he was a very important player. I wouldn't say that in 1993 he was an outstanding player, but he was a good player. But Paul Sousa was definitely the one that hurt the most. He was developed in the academy. He was Benfica player since he was, I don't know, 10, 12, something like that, like a little kid. And then to see him leave Benfica and go to Sporting, that really, really hurt the fans. So I would say that was the most visible thing to the fans, but there were a lot of problems in the club at the time. There was no money to pay players at all. So in the 1993-94 season, some of the Benfica players were not getting paid for three months. And in 1993, what happened was that since they were not getting paid, they had a legal reason to revoke the contract and to go play wherever they wanted, right? So Paulo Sousa and Pacheco did that. They revoked the contract. They could legally do it. Benfica didn't have money to pay. They went to Sporting. And also Rui Costa also got an invite from Sporting. And João Pinto, he had something signed with Sporting also. So they were going to take four of our best players. But then For some reason, Rui Costa didn't end up going. I think there was a lot of family pressure for him not to go because his family is, hardcore Benfiquista. That's what I've heard. Not, I don't know if it's necessarily true. Just putting a disclaimer here. And João Pinto, he went to south of Spain in a place called Benidorm for vacation in the off season. And Jorge Brito got on a car and went there with someone and basically said, "Hey, I'll pay you whatever you want to come back to Benfica." And that happened. And they had a press conference. They brought him. He's like, "Oh, he's one of ours. He would never go to Sporting." But he had a contract or something signed or an agreement with Sporting. So he stayed. And actually, that decision to bring him back was one of the most important decisions for the season after because João Pinto, yeah, he was hands down the best player playing in Portugal the year after.
So this 1993-94 season promised to be a difficult season given all
Yeah.
the problems you mentioned. It would end well. As far as the transfers, obviously Benfica can't bring in any significant players this season, but they're forced to lose the likes of Paulo Futre.
Yeah.
He's sold to Olympique Marseille in France. We mentioned Souza and Pacheco go to Sporting. Later in the season, Alexander Mostovoy, who hardly featured, he joins French club Caen. This season, Benfica actually would regain the league title after 3 years. They would reach the semifinals of the Cup Winners' Cup. There's that epic match against Bayer Leverkusen in the quarterfinals, the 4-4
Yeah.
match. Benfica managed to win the league title with Tony as manager, and there's a presidential change again, as in January, Jorge de Brito is replaced by Manuel Damasio.
Mhm.
What were the lessons from that season?
This season, I would say it's the most important season for me as a Benfiquista, and I've been a fan for over 40 years because in the summer of '93, when the new season started, I mean, Benfica fans were just like, we're going to lower divisions. This club is just going down. It's impossible that we're going to do well. We don't have money to pay salaries. We lost our best players. We had to sell Paul Futre. How the hell are we going to be successful? Right? I remember like opening, we have a famous newspaper in Portugal called A Bola. It means the ball. And I remember like opening the newspaper and you just like read like Benfica doesn't have money to pay salaries. Tony will have to be the coach because we have no one else. We can't pay anyone. And we were all anticipating like being in sixth or seventh or tenth or the worst possible season in Benfica history. And what we had was actually the opposite. I think that's one of the beauties of Benfica. It's when we are low and down when we stand out and when we our weaknesses become strengths because that team was actually one of the best squads that I've ever seen play for Benfica. That win at Sporting Stadium, 6-3, João Pinto scores an hat-trick, Isaías scores 2 goals. I mean, who would have thought like winning 6-3 against Sporting at their stadium at the end of the championship? Sporting had amazing players, Paulo Sousa, Pacheco, Balakov, Figo, I mean, Cadet, Stan Valks, which is the Dutch center back. I mean, individually, they had a better team than us, but this group of 11 guys, and plus with the ones on the bench and Tony, they really got together. And I think it was probably the last time they were Portuguese champions in which the squad was not driven by money, was not driven by transfer wishes to be. No, they got together and said, "Hey guys, this is really bad, but we believe in ourselves. This club deserves this. The fans deserve this. I know we're not getting paid. That's another problem. We need to do our best and win this title." And it was unforgettable title in 1993, 1994. Manuel Damasio was already president when we beat Sporting 3-6 away at their field. Unfortunately, that title also marks the beginning of the 11-year streak in which Benfica did not win any title that started with Manuel Damasio. That pretty much he destroyed a team that just had become Portuguese champions. We can talk about that moving forward.
It's almost unimaginable to think that Benfica would not win a league title for 11 years. Because
Crazy.
it was like every other year, Benfica, around for like 30 years or so, every other year they were champions, it seemed
Yeah,
like.
true, true. We didn't win, which is just unimaginable. The biggest club in Portugal, biggest stadium, with more fans, clearly with many more fans, with investing more money than everyone else. 10 years of pure misery. I don't know if you know this, but we in Benfica call this time the Vietnam. So it was the Vietnam era of Benfica. It was just our lowest point in our 120-year existence. Yeah, it was awful. And I was there growing up, so it's really ingrained in my mind.
We come to the 1994-95 season. We have the return of former player Arthur Jorge on the bench.
Yeah.
However, he was an emblematic manager of Porto when he came. This is the year also that you have the significant loss of Rui Costa in terms of transfers. He joins Italian side of Fiorentina.
Yeah.
As far as players coming in, you have the excellent Belgian goalkeeper Michel Prudhomme, who arrived from Mechelen. You have the defender Dimash from Guimarães. You have the likes of Tavares and Nelo coming from Boavista. Paulo Madeira from Maritimo. Croatian player Mario Stanic from
Hmm.
Sporting Gijón, as well as Claudio Caniggia, the Argentine
Hmm.
striker, many remember from 1990 World Cup. He had been suspended for 1 year from football and he was still contracted to Roma, but he came
Hmm.
on loan to Benfica for 1 season. As far as players leaving, you have the Swedish midfielder Stefan Schwarz. He joins Arsenal. We mentioned Rui Costa joins Fiorentina. Rui Aguas leaves Benfica for good, joining Estrela Amadora. Former Russian players we mentioned before, Sergei Yuran and Vasily Kulkov, they jointly joined Porto. And goalkeeper Silvinho, he joins Setúbal. So a lot of comings and goings.
Hmm.
Again, Benfica participates in the group phase of a Champions League. They advance from their group, but they meet the great AC Milan team and lose in the quarterfinals. Eventually, Benfica, they finished third that season, which was a new low for them. I don't think they had finished anything other than second. I can't remember when that must have been the last time they finished actually like 84, 85. So that was like
Hmm.
a,
Hmm.
a decade. But even that was a rarity. So let's say in 20, 30 years, they may have finished third like once or twice.
Yeah,
Who
yeah,
knows?
yeah, that's true. And we actually ended up being sixth a few seasons later. So you can see how low we went.
Not a good season, and it would be the beginning of the trend as Porto were starting to win titles consecutively. Benfica is sliding, and every season after this, it seems like there's like a million players coming and going every
Yeah, it's
transfer window.
ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's a truck of players comes in, a truck of players goes. Yeah, it was just pathetic. Yeah, what
Yeah.
happened?
So we come to the 1995-96 season. In the beginning, still Arthur Jorge is the manager, but he would be replaced very quickly in September. And he'd be replaced by another former manager, in fact, former Portugal manager as well, Mario Wilson, the legendary
Hmm.
manager. So, as far as the players coming in, the Brazilians, Ricardo and Valdo, they returned from Paris Saint-Germain, but at this time, they're like at the veteran stage of their career.
Yeah, true.
You have the Bulgarian Ilian Iliev come from Levski, Romanian Basara Panduru coming from Stoia Bucharest, Jose Calado coming from Estrela de Amadora. As far as the players leaving, we mentioned Caniggia, that was only a 1 season loan, so he leaves. But you have many players leaving. Neno, the goalkeeper, he joins Guimarães. The veteran Veloso, he retires. The Brazilian defender William, he joins Bastia in France. Abel Javier, he joins Bari in Italy.
Mhm.
Paulo Madeira, he leaves, joins Belenenses. The Brazilian Carlos Moser, he joins the J League Kashima Antlers. Vitor Paneira joins Guimarães. Nelo goes back to Boavista. The
Yeah,
Croatian Mario Stanic joins Club Bruges. Isaias, we mentioned
yeah,
that he joins
yeah,
the English Premier League, Coventry City. Another veteran, Cesar Brito, he joins Belenenses. So many players leaving. It's like a team overhaul. And of course, I think it's surprising that they actually finished second that season.
yeah. It's
So many
amazing, right?
changes. Yeah.
No, it's crazy.
They do win the cup that season. They beat Sporting in the final.
So we didn't end up being 10 years without winning a title. It was from 96 to 2004.
Or
So it's
that's still
actually
8 years,
8 years.
significant. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
And in the UEFA Cup, they reached the third round before losing to Bayern Munich, where I think Jurgen Klinsmann, that's the match where Jurgen Klinsmann scores like four
yeah.
goals, right? If I'm not
Four
mistaken.
goals. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
true. I was at that game, 1996. It was a Sporting, Benfica Sporting, also at the National Stadium. Benfica won, I think, 3-1, something like that. But it
Right.
was a game that should not have happened. I don't know if you know, but when Benfica scored the first goal, Mauro Aires, an Argentinian striker, Benfica fan, he shot, like this rocket. It's called Very Light. And this rocket flew across the stadium, across the pitch, and landed on a guy's chest and killed him on the spot.
Oh my God.
There were no phones at the time. We did not know what was going on. And Benfica scored. We were at the Benfica fan side celebrating, and we see the Sporting fans just opening up in the middle of the stands, like, hey, what's going on? And then thousands of them come and run to try and beat us up. And we thought, man, it's just a goal, just relax. You're probably going to score a goal and tie the game. But then we started to listen on the radio that, a Sporting fan died in the stands when Benfica scored the first goal, with a rocket in his chest. That goes to show kind of how crazy football was at the time. Imagine nowadays a fan dies on the stand, you with a rocket fired by fans from the other club, yeah, you stop the match. There's no questions about it. You're not going to continue playing. So that game, even though Benfica won the title, is marked forever because of what happened. And actually, the guy that shot that rocket, he went to jail and he spent a few years in jail because of that. I think he's not in jail anymore, but this happened such a long time ago. And just to go back a bit to the 94-95 season, I think it's quite relevant to mention that Artur Jorge and Manuel Damasio completely destroyed the 93-94, the Benfica champions at the time. So Damasio had a dream of becoming Benfica European team again, successful in Europe, right? So, and he thought, Tony is not good for this. We need to go get Artur Jorge, right? Artur Jorge, even though he's very much connected to Porto because of his coaching years in Porto, he was actually in the 70s a very important player for Benfica. He was an amazing striker, even in the late 60s. He scored tons of goals, but this happened so long ago that people still connect him with Porto a lot, right? So he got rid of a lot of important players like Vitor Paneira, Isaías, and then Moser left, Cesar Brito left, Veloso retired. So Benfica lost a lot of good players, and then the players that came in to replace them, they were just not good. Sorry, guys. I don't know Nelu and Tavares if you're watching this, but you might be the nicest guys, but you were not good players for Benfica. And, Stanic was not an outstanding striker. And that 94-95 team was just awful because they completely destroyed a team that was successful and a coach that was successful. And I think Damasio got too greedy, and Artur Jorge was just not in his best shape. Unfortunately, the next season he had really bad health problem, and that kind of took him away from being a coach for quite some time. But I just want to say that season 94-95 when Artur Jorge came in, just that was the trigger of this whole Vietnam era of 11 years without winning a title.
Arthur Jorge himself says that he had a disappointing spell because he feels that he was always regarded as a Porto man.
Yeah, yeah, true,
And
true.
so he
And
feels he could never succeed as a result.
yeah, and even some Benfiquistas say, well, he was actually hired by Pinto da Costa, the Porto president, to do this, to destroy. Of course, that's not true, but it's still a rumor that goes on.
We come to the 1996-97 season. We have a new manager, Paulo Autuori, but
Mhm.
of course, he'd be replaced before the end of the season by Emmanuel Jose. As far as the transfers, we have the Moroccan Tahar El Khalej, who came from Uniao Leiria. We have the Colombian defender Jorge Bermudez from America de Cali, Swedish striker Martin Pringle from Helsingborg, Brazilian defender Ronaldo Guerreiro from Atlético Mineiro. As far as the players leaving, Ricardo Gomes, the Brazilian defender, retired. Paulo Bento joined Oviedo. Daniel Kennedy, a promising defender, joined Paris Saint-Germain. In the new year, in January, Dimash would join Juventus. As far as the league race, again, Porto wins the title. This is their third in a row. Sporting finished second. There's like almost a 30-point gap between,
27.
yeah, between
It's crazy.
Benfica and Porto. Benfica even lose the cup final against Boavista 3-2.
Yeah,
They do make the quarterfinals of the Cup Winners' Cup. They lose to Ricochet's Fiorentina.
true.
So the rut has more or less set in. Benfica doesn't look like a title winning side in these years as we come
Yeah,
towards the end of the decade.
yeah. And let me just say that here in the 1996-97 season, you start to see the quality of the players Benfica bring in just it lowers and lowers and
Yeah,
lowers.
none of them were big names, the ones we
No,
mentioned.
like Pringle, the Swedish guy. I mean, I even doubt that he was good enough to play for Setúbal or Estrela da Amadora, which were
Yeah.
teams from the bottom places in the league. And that's just an example because when you get a player that's not so good, it's fine. You have other ones, but when you have two, three, four, six, seven, eight, nine awful players, it's not a surprise we were almost 30
Yeah,
points behind Porto,
but let's remind ourselves also that this is the first season of the Bosman ruling.
Correct.
So
Correct.
Benfica and even Porto, perhaps, they're not guaranteed to be able to sign the best of the best Portuguese players, as
Correct.
now they can just go and join other foreign leagues. That's an extra hurdle, perhaps, for Benfica that kind of shows some of the quality of the players that they signed.
True. True.
Yeah.
And like I've said before many times, Benfica didn't have money. So yeah, we need a striker. We need a center back. We don't have money. Hey, let's get a guy from Helsingborg, from Sweden, and let's see what happens.
Yeah.
That's pretty much what they did.
Yeah, they're looking for bargains, basically, hoping
Yeah,
they
yeah, yeah,
make it, they can sell them
yeah.
for more money down the road. Yeah.
True, true, true.
Which in a way shows the state of the club at this point.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the 96-97 season, we're gonna go through, in my opinion, the worst 3 years of this 11-year nightmare that we called Vietnam, which is when we had a change in presidency again, and this I can't really find even the words to describe him. This new president comes that pretty much wanted to make money and sell the club, or sell the club and make money off of it. It was probably the worst period in Benfica history for me.
So this 1997-98 season, you have Manuel Damasio. He's present until the end of October, and then you have Joao Valle Azevedo. Again, for this 97-98 season, there's coaching changes, a high turnover of players coming and going. The season starts with Manuel Jose as manager. Eventually, the Scottish Graham Souness comes on board. As far as the transfer activity, you have Nuno Gomes coming from Boavista, who would actually be one of the better Benfica players of this era. Erwin Sanchez returns once
Hmm.
again from
Yeah,
Boavista.
true.
Paulo Madeira comes back from Belenenses. The Paraguayan defender Carlos Gamara comes, as well as a Russian goalkeeper Ovchinnikov from Lokomotiv Moscow. Dutch forward Gaston Taumant arrives from Feyenoord. Little known English player Scott Minto arrived from Chelsea, as well as a certain player named Deco, who
Yeah.
never wore Benfica shirt. And
No.
I wonder what happened to him.
Yeah, I wonder. I don't know. I've barely heard about that guy.
So then later in the season, when Graham Souness comes, you have Brazilian defender Amaral comes from Parma. You have English striker Brian Dean from Sheffield United. You have the Czech, the one who scored a beautiful goal against Portugal,
Yep.
Karel Poborski, comes from Manchester United. There's a lot of players right there. I didn't even go through half the list of players
Yeah.
coming that season.
Yeah.
But the players leaving, you have Bermudez joins Boca Juniors.
Hmm. Valdo, yeah.
Yeah, Valdo joining the J League at Nagoya Grampus. The Bulgarian Ilan Iliev goes back to Bulgaria to Slavia Sofia. Mauro Aires joins Estrela Amadora. Eventually, Carlos Gamara in the new year, he joins Corinthians in Brazil. Gaston Taumant leaves, joins Anderlecht. And also, let's mention that Deco himself is loaned to Alverca for this
Yeah.
season.
Yeah, true, true. It's quite ironic because if you look at the list of players, I mean, Poborski, Brian Dean, Ovchinnikov, Minto, Gamarra was one of the best center backs I've ever watched play at Benfica. What a player. And he was there for, I don't know, seven,
Few
eight
months,
months.
yeah. Yeah.
Nuno Gomes, we had a Brazilian guy called Paulo Nunes, which is really good. Amaral was a very good midfielder. And then it wasn't working. Why? Because the club was being managed by a lunatic. Pretty much, he was a lunatic. Benfica had no money to pay salaries. So how can you have motivated players and a manager that can motivate them if they're not getting paid? And I remember at the time, João Pinto was the captain, and he told this famous story in which the players would go to him in the locker room saying, "Hey, can you go speak with the president? We didn't get paid today." And then he would go to the floor upstairs and talk with the president, and he said, "Don't worry, you're going to get paid tomorrow." The next day, they didn't get paid. He would go, "Don't worry, you're going to get paid tomorrow." And this happened like on and constantly during the season. I mean, it's impossible. Even you can have Pelé, Eusebio, Messi, Cristiano Ronaldo. If they're not paying your players, they don't have money to pay for their stuff, their rent, their houses, their food, whatever. And remember, at this time, players didn't get 30 million euros a year. They got less money. So the main cause of this debacle of these three awful seasons was a horrible president, a guy that said, because he says what people wants to hear. He said, if I become Benfica president, I'm going to bring back Rui Costa. I'm going to bring Fernando Couto, which was the center back of Portugal. I'm going to bring the main players of the national football team. And it was all a lie. He brought no one. There's a lot of stories about him. If you're interested in knowing more about this guy, go on YouTube, look at a documentary called Lucky Me, put his name and type Lucky Me, Vale Azevedo. Lucky Me was the name of the boat that he bought when he was a Benfica president. And just watch that documentary and you will get a good sense of what type of person this guy was. He's still alive, living in England because he can't come to Portugal. He was arrested. He did time, and then he left England and he's living in London somewhere in, the most expensive areas of London. He's a lawyer, so he knows how to get around the legal system. But luckily, 3 years after, this other guy came called Manuel Vilarinho, and this was already in the 2000s, and kicked him out from the presidency. He became president because if he stayed there for another term, I'm very confident that the club would never end because Benfica will never end and will last forever. But I'm sure that something a lot worse would have happened. The club would have been refounded with another name. Clearly he was going to try and sell the team to foreign investors because all he wanted from being a president was self-promotion and getting as much money as possible because Benfica is the biggest club in Portugal. 6 million fans, fans in Portugal, fans all around the world. So much money moves around in the club. That's why I say this was the darkest period of this 11-year nightmare in which we didn't win a championship.
Porto won their fourth straight title.
Yeah,
Benfica finished
yeah,
second. Just to show the state of the club, in the first round of the UEFA Cup, they lost to a French club Bastia, which would have been unthinkable just a few
yeah,
years before.
yeah. That's ridiculous. Yeah.
We're nearing the end of the decade. We come to the 1998-99 season with Graham Souness in charge, who would be replaced towards the tail end of the season, and Shu Han would be the caretaker. Now, at this point, it looks like Benfica don't have any ambitions to win the league title. It's more or less clear that Porto are the dominant side.
True.
So, as far as the players coming in, Graham Souness looks to England, the league he knows best. So he signs Liverpool midfielder Michael Thomas, Welsh player Mark Pembridge from Sheffield Wednesday, Hugo Porfirio comes from Racing Santander. Later in the season, he signs the veteran Welsh striker Dean Saunders from Sheffield United. Jorge Cadete, former Sporting star, he comes from Celta Vigo. You have another English defender, Gary Charles, comes from Aston Villa. Another English player, Steve Harkness, comes from Liverpool. And again, not many of these players are stars, or at least they're not stars at this stage of their career. As far as the players leaving, you have the Romanian Basaru Panduru. He joins Porto. Now, if there's an example of mismanagement, it's Deco.
Yeah.
He's immediately sold to Salgueiros. Brian Dean later goes back to England to join Middlesbrough. Scott Minto in the new year he joins West Ham United, and the Swedish striker Martin Pringle in March he joins
Yeah.
English League Charlton
Charlton. Yeah.
Athletic. Yet another disappointing season. Porto wins for the fifth consecutive time, and in Europe, even though they're in the Champions League, they finish behind Kaiserslautern in the group.
Mhm.
The decade is not ending well.
No, I mean, you can say it differently, but it's not, it didn't end well at all. Also, the fact that the team was awful, the players were not good. All this batch of English players that came. I think the only player that brought quality was, ironically enough, a player that stayed for a little amount of time, which was Brian Dean. He was a striker, and he did a really good pairing with Nuno Gomes. But he left because he was not getting paid. And he said, I need money to eat and I need money to pay my house. And I actually interviewed him for Visão Vermelha, and he said, I would love to stay at Benfica, but I was not getting paid and I needed money. That's why he went back to England, right? It was really unthinkable that this new coach, Graham Souness, just brought, like, I don't know, six, seven English players. And I think it was the first time that Benfica even had a player from England. And then all of a sudden it's six or seven. It was, in terms of performance and quality of football, it was the worst season. Even though Benfica in 2000, 2001 ended in sixth place in the championship, in terms of quality, I think it was the worst squad that I've ever seen. Just awful, awful. And yeah, like you said, Porto they were champions. I mean, 5 seasons in a row. I mean, against a Benfica team like this, to be honest, they had their way facilitated to become 5 years champion in a row. But it was just very, very, very dark season. I remember that I think it was January 2000, while moving a bit into the next season, we had the lowest attendance that I've ever seen at a Benfica game in our Estádio da Luz. We had 3,000 people against Amora for a Portuguese Cup game. Very small club, but still, we're talking about 100,000 people attendance. And then you have 3,000 people in the stadium. I mean, stadium was always empty. Players were not getting paid. The team was horrible. It was not, not just on the pitch. It was everything that related to Benfica was just in shambles. It was just completely dark, and no one wanted to see the games because people always assumed we're going to lose. We're horrible. We have a horrible team. So very
Yeah.
dark times, as you can see.
The decade does not end well, even though you
No.
have quality German manager Jupp Heynckes as the manager. To make matters worse, you have Sporting Club of Portugal winning the league title.
Yeah,
Even them
19
alone.
years later.
Yeah, yeah. And that was basically it for the decade of the 1990s. Now, as the decade ended, Benfica was at its lowest ebb.
Yeah.
There was a generation of fans who had never witnessed this. What was the general belief for the immediate future into the millennium?
Yeah, like I said, we were not hoping for anything new coming in the near future. It was an awful decade. It ended with a horrible season. Benfica ended third with 69 points. And it's important to mention that the last coach we had this season was, like you said, Jupp Heynckes, the German coach. And he did, together with Valius Vid, this, yeah, I'm not going to insult him. I know this is an honorable podcast. So they did the most horrific thing at the end of the season. So they fired our best player, João Pinto, that pretty much he carried the team by himself for the last 6 years. They fired him. They pushed him to accept a transfer to Deportivo de Coruña. He said, "I don't want to go. I have a contract with the club." Apparently, there is a rumor that he had a lifetime contract with the club, but this Valias Vid guy, he wanted to be the star. He wanted to be number one, and he would never accept that any player would be bigger than him. So together with the coach, they decided to fire him, which was ridiculous because he was worth a lot of money. He was one of the best players in Europe. So they said, "You're fired. You can go out the door." And I remember there were riots. Well, not necessarily riots, but people were outside the Benfica stadium, like going crazy, like, "What the hell are you doing? You're firing our best player? He carried the whole team for 6 years, and now you fire him?" Guess what he did? He went to Sporting. Sporting became champions in the next season with him. I mean, it was just waves of it was like a tsunami of disappointments and horrible news, and then Sporting become champion after 19 years without winning anything. Then João Pinto is fired from Benfica, goes to Sporting, helps them become champions at the time with Mari Jardel, which was an amazing striker that they got from Turkey that played in Porto for many years. I mean, it couldn't have ended in a worst possible way than João Pinto being fired and joining Sporting. It was just, yeah, horrific.
If you had to go back and pinpoint,
Mhm.
what do you think was the reference point of all of these Benfica's problems? I know we
Well,
mentioned a few. We mentioned the summer of 93, the whole 94, 95 Jorge season, but what do you think was the source of it all?
I think this was a mix of Benfica being incompetent in terms of management, for sure. As we've talked about, we've gone through a lot of presidents. So I would say very poor management, very bad decisions from the Benfica. So in Portugal, we call the Benfica the sócios. So you can become a member of the club, you pay a monthly fee, and then you can vote for the presidency, right? Some really bad decisions from the members that chose, for example, Val Iasvid to become the president. Just so you know, in the next time there were elections, Valias Vedu, he was going to win again. So he did 3 horrific years, won 0 titles. He's just the only title he won was a Tour de Portugal, cycling Tour de Portugal. That's it, 3 years. N Nothing else. Benfica won in, and Benfica has like 40 or 50 sports.
Oh, it's a
Basket.
multi-sports club. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so we have so many sports. Zero. We just won in 3 years. We won a cycling Tour of Portugal. And he was going to win again. So you can see how awful the decisions that the Benfica members did. But then Luckily, we had this new guy that on a very famous Portuguese TV show on a debate, and it's still remembered at this time, almost 30 years later. He basically said, "You're a liar, and I have the documentation here to prove it." And then that's kind of when Benfica fans were like, "Huh, maybe this guy is a liar and he shouldn't stay." So a lot of bad decisions from the members, awful players, horrible signing policy. Like you said, 25 players leave the club, 25 players join the club in one season. The next season, 15 players leave the club, 20 players come in. I mean, which made the team spend a lot of money, and it's just throwing money at problems and not competence. You need competence to be successful in anything, right? And if you just throw money at problems, that's not the easiest way. I mean, it is the easiest way, but it's not guaranteed it's going to work. And I think also we're not going to discuss this now, but one of the things that is happening now with the club is exactly the same thing. It's just Benfica has a lot of money because we have a lot of members, we have a lot of attendance, and we just historically been throwing money just to solve problems. Buy 20 players, sell 20 players. So, and then the coaches that came, they were not good, unfortunately. Manuel José, Paulo Tuori, Graham Souness, Jupp Heynckes, they did not do a good job. I know it's not a very good, the most comfortable setting if you're coaching a club that is going through all these problems. It was a combination of many, many things. But if I have to say the main one, definitely poor management. Just horrific manner the club was led by some. I wouldn't say necessarily all, because I think João Santos did a really good job. But since João Santos left, we didn't have a good president this decade.
I know there were so many transfers, but who does stand out for you as a success and who was the greatest disappointment based on expectations?
Yeah. So I would say that the biggest success was definitely João Pinto because of not only what he did in the famous Sporting Benfica, the 6-3 of 1994, but because of the fact that I also mentioned here, he basically took the team on his shoulders for 6 years. Then we had really good players like Valdo, Ricardo Gomes. Moser was one of my favorite center backs. I mean, if Moser was playing nowadays, he would definitely be the best center back in Europe. Poborski was also a very good player from the Czech Republic. I mean, Nuno Gomes. So we had a handful of good players, but the we had so many bad players that kind of outweigh the scale in terms of quality. We had so many failures. Bermudez, like you mentioned, he was a guy that came from Boca Juniors, Argentina. Mentioned has the best center back in Latin America. I saw him score a bicycle kick, but as an own goal. How can you score an own goal with a bicycle kick? I mean, the things you saw on the pitch were like, and then Michael Thomas was absolutely horrific, the guy that came from Liverpool. He was at the end of his career. So many, and we're not talking about all the players that came, because if we were, we would need probably 4 or 5 hours. It was so many players that came that had not
Yeah.
even an inch of quality
And I just want to
to
repeat
play.
this. I have the list of transfer every season, and I was only reading the better known players. If I had to
Exactly.
read every single name that came and left, like you said, it would take hours.
Hours. Yeah, it was insane. But if I have to point the biggest, I mean, Canigia was the biggest failure. What a very good striker from a starter from the Argentina national team. He only stayed here at one club. Paul Futre, I mean, he was not a failure necessarily because of him, but because he didn't stay for that long, because Benfica had to make money, they had to sell him. So yeah, some failures, unfortunately, but I think if I can pinpoint a failure, it would definitely be the amount of players that came in instead of just naming one or two or three. It was just the ridiculous amount of bad players that joined the club.
In terms of managers, like you said, it could not have been an easy task. But
Yeah,
who do you think were successful given the resources that they had, and which ones failed to handle the situation?
yeah. So successful ones definitely too. Eriksson in the beginning of the decade, winning the title in 1991. I know and I've read quite a lot about him, and he basically changed how the team coached. Even the players said his methods were very, very different. He was changing how Benfica played football to a much better way. So he was quite groundbreaking when he came. And then my favorite, which is I would say my top favorite because I have an emotional connection with the 1994 championship, Tony. So Tony, even though he was not, I would say, necessarily the best technical coach, he could really put in the players' heads the importance and the responsibility and the
Yeah.
pride they should feel
He
for to
was
play
he
for
was the
Benfica.
reliable in-house man that Benfica could always call upon when in
We could
difficulty.
always count on him.
Yeah.
Always count on him. And yeah, that title from 1994, if I would have to pick a favorite, Tony for sure, because of the emotional part that comes with him managing the team. And also, like I said, at the beginning of our conversation, we are a very emotional fan base, right? So even though we might have a very bad season, but if we feel that the team did their best, the coach did their best, and they are truly connected with the club's values, we understand that. But unfortunately, that's not the scenario that happens in most situations.
We have to also put in perspective that during this whole decade, the neighbors Sporting were in a
Mhm.
way even worse crisis. Like you said, they had not won the title since 1982.
Yeah.
Do you think had they been more competitive, perhaps Benfica would have made the extra effort to get back to the top?
That's a very good question. And then thinking about it, I would say it's a good thing that Sporting was really bad as well. Because if that happened, I think Benfica would have been even worse. Because I do really think that Benfica's problems were self-inflicted, not because of Porto or Sporting. We just had really awful people in charge of the club and in charge of the football team. So if I would have to answer, I would say that no, we wouldn't have been better off if Sporting was stronger, unfortunately.
So at the end of this decade, what was the status of Benfica in the Portuguese football landscape as Porto were dominant and even in the millennium Sporting were making a comeback?
Yeah. So that's also a very good question. This was very unimaginable times for Benfica fans at the time, right? So because we were always used, since the club was founded in 1994, so the club is 120 years old, of course you can't win every season. No club, no team in the world wins the title every season, but we were used to winning 6 in 10 years, 7 in 10 years, sometimes eight, sometimes nine, sometimes three or four, whatever it was. But going through 11 years without winning and not only not winning, but clearly how the shape of the club was financially horrible. No Benfiquistas in the stands. There was no team spirit. There was nothing. You could see that the players didn't want to be there. The coaches didn't want to be there. No one wanted to be there, but they were all for some reason involved in the same club. So if you talk about the status of Benfica, Benfica never stopped being the biggest club in Portugal. I'm not saying this because I'm a Benfica fan, but it's a fact. We have more fans wherever Benfica goes. We have more fans than everyone else. Everyone watches more Benfica games on TV. Benfica has more members than Sporting in Porto. We invest more money than Sporting in Porto. So that's not even a question. So Benfica never stopped being we have more titles than Porto and Sporting. But we were definitely, especially towards the end of the decade, thinking, hey, what's going to happen to Benfica? The Benfica we grew up with and the Benfica we knew ended. Are we going to become I don't know, Estrela da Amadora? And with all the respect for those teams, or Setúbal, like teams that don't win titles, and we might even go to a lower division. So we were very disappointed and not motivated for the early 2000s, if I can answer that.
So in closing,
Mhm.
for Benfica fans and historians, what is the legacy of this disappointing decade? Is it a cautionary tale on mismanagement? what is the general takeaway of this decade of stagnation?
Mhm. So I think this decade, like I've mentioned many times, definitely was one of, if not the poorest, one of the poorest decades of the club's history. That scarred a lot of Benfica fans. A lot of Benfica fans that are, I would say, between 35, 40 years old now and over, this really left a mark, right? And this mark still shows. So, for example, we're having elections this year, right? Rui Costa is the president. There is a lot of discussion that he might not be voted for being president again. And of course, we're having different candidates coming. And whenever there's a different candidate coming, there's always someone saying, oh, he's probably like Valias Verde, like we're still scarred from this period, even though it was what 30 years ago, 28 years ago. So I think one of the biggest learnings that we as Benfiquistas need to take is that we need to do better, right? We need to go to the general assemblies. We need to study the finance of the club. We need to understand the plans that the boards have for the club. We need to go and vote. We need to go and vote we need to become more involved in the club because Benfica is moving around millions and millions of euros, right? Nowadays, any player is sold for 10 million, 20 million, right? So and this is our money. We own the club. Legally, the club in Benfica doesn't belong to an investor. Well, the company Benfica is owned mostly by the Benfica members. We have more than 51% of the club. So it legally belongs to us, and we need to do a better job understanding what's going on in the club. Because if that doesn't happen, then we're gonna get someone taking advantage of us and ripping us apart like Valias Verde did and Manuel Damasio did in the 90s. So definitely if I would pinpoint the biggest learning, that's the learning. Like so it if we don't want this to happen again, we need to become member as fans and as members, right? So but I feel a bitter sweet feeling when it comes to this decade, right? Because it started off being very good with the 1991 title. Then it went down a bit. Then 1993, 94 with amazing win at Sporting and we win the title and then it went downhill. So I really do feel that this decade was very important for me. And even though we didn't win many titles and it was quite bad at the end of it, it really shaped my fandom for Benfica, right? Because, like I said, I pretty much spent my formative years at Benfica Stadium. I didn't mention it, but at the time, you could actually go see the team practice. Not anymore. The team is hiding away in some sort of training ground. You can't do it anymore. When I was a kid, you would just show up there. The doors were open. You could go see Benfica train and the players would walk in front of you and you would ask for their autographs. You'd take pictures with them. So it was very important for me as a Benfiquista, right? Unfortunately, the results were very bad. So I have a bittersweet feeling or bittersweet taste about this decade. It was horrible. The beginning was okay with a title, then it went low again, then it came back up in 94, and then it was just downhill, right? Now it's a weird feeling, but it's very close to my heart. And that's why when you reach out to me, you said, I want to talk to you about the 90s. I said, you found the right guy for that because I was there in person. I remember everything and it's still very present in my mind. But just to go back to what I said, I think the main lesson learned from this decade is that yeah, we can't, Benfiquistas, we can't let this happen again. We have to be more involved. We have to go vote. We have to understand. We have to study what's going on in the club because the vultures are gonna come back and every vulture is gonna try and take away a piece of the meat because Benfica moves around a lot of money.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. Yeah, I can imagine it was not a very enjoyable discussion.
There you go. You might think, well, maybe we have a guy from Benfica talking about the 90s. I actually, it goes back to the bittersweet. taste that I feel. It's very close to my heart, and it brings back a lot of good memories, but it also brings a lot of bad memories, right? But I always enjoy talking about Benfica, no matter what decade, no matter what game. So yeah, I would like to thank you for your invitation, Sahan. It was a pleasure discussing this with you. Yeah, I wish you all the best for the next interviews that you make. And yeah, like I said, it's very impressive for me that someone on the other side of the world knows so much about Benfica and studies titles and players coming in and transfers and coaches, which I think it's very cool and very interesting.
Thank you, appreciate it. Well, I mean, I lived those seasons too from afar, but
Yeah,
obviously with an eye on the Portuguese league and football in general. And also remind everyone that all our respective contact information is listed on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Tiago, thank you once again, and yeah, hope to continue these discussions on football history.
of course, man. It was great speaking to you and all the best and a shout out to everyone that watches this. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.